So I put the extra space between God makes a promise and the paragraph because I want to see all the proofreaders if they caught it. And the answer is no. I'm sure you do. So Tom, are we recording? Good enough. All right. So this week we're going to be talking about blood covenants in the Bible, and we're going to get a little closer to what we can do as individuals. Next week, as I might say, the fun begins, because next week we're going to get into the blood covenant, the 9 elements, and how it applies to our covenant with Jesus. I think you're really going to enjoy that. So that's a tease for next week, but we're going to get closer with this week. So kind of use your imagination here. It was a dark night and cold, and it was another night in a dark, cold desert for a man who became father to a nation. You'll probably figure out who it is. And it was another night where the impossible was promised but not fulfilled. Here was a Middle Eastern person who needed to know that to deliver on his words to him, words that uprooted him from his hometown, his job, and his family, and words that put extreme pressure on him and his wife, not only for making travelers in a strange land, but telling them they would bear a child when she was well beyond the age when women were getting pregnant. And they did know what women were back then. Oh my goodness, I thought I'd get a bigger laugh. I guess it did. Thank you, Jenny. That got the customary laugh there. So in this environment, self would confirm his covenant with him in a way that would seem barbaric to us today. But to this man, it made total sense because he knew it was used time and time again when men bought and sold land. It was something called a blood covenant. So as we've been talking at the last 2 weeks, we detailed the history of blood covenants. Then last week, we talked about a little more about blood covenants and the blood and the heart involved with it. But now we're getting into the spiritual aspect. So a covenant is confirmed. Now, you probably figured out that was Abraham and Sarah we were talking about there. If you got your Bibles, Genesis 15, 8 through 10, it says, "But Abram replied, 'O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?'" Now he's talking about the land he was promised in Genesis 12. And the Lord told him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." So Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Now, I'm not going to get into that. But what he did was God only told him, he said, "I want you to go ahead and bring these to me." And Abram already knew what to do with them because he'd seen it before. Because in Middle Eastern culture, they would, when they would have like a land agreement, they would go ahead and they would do this sacrifice. They would split the animals after they had already sacrificed them. And then what would happen was both the person selling the land and the person buying the land would stand on either side, and then they would switch places. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk more about that next week. But they would walk between them and exchange positions and places. And that was part of the agreement that they were going to have. So Abraham knew exactly what was going on as far as this goes. But what was going to happen next, I mean, he didn't know where God was going to be on this thing. And you have to wonder, I mean, because he knew about blood covenants. We knew that since Genesis. There's something in the culture. But what he didn't know was, if I'm going to be entering a blood covenant with God, how's that going to work? And of course, we find out how that happened. Abraham, as we know him, was the Middle Eastern man. He had the questions for the God he served. The questions would be the same for any man in situation and can hardly be unexpected, since being old, you would be the father of a great nation, let alone a father at all, was not humanly possible. Sarai, who is now called Sarah, was at least 65 years old when Abram told her that they were going to have a son. And Abram was at least 75 at the time, so you see why they had their doubts. And when it was another 25 years before the seminal moment in the desert. So they waited 25 years. And, you know, I mean, think about that. You get a promise from God and it says, okay, I'm gonna use you. I'm going to send you to a new land. I'm going to give you a son, all that. And that's good news to a woman who's barren, because in the Middle Eastern times, if you were barren, that was cursed. And so she said, oh, the curse is going to be lifted. Now, she didn't know how it was going to happen. But seeing as she was 65 years old at the time, she was thinking, you better get this pretty quick. And then it was 25 more years. So hope deferred is makes the heart sick, I think it says in the Bible, Proverbs 13:12. So she was basically saying and thinking in her lives, course, in the next chapter, when he confirmed it, the angel confirmed it, Sarah laughed. And some people think, oh my goodness, that's so disrespectful. But you think about the situation. It was a little humorous to think that a woman that old, who was 90 years old, was going to have a child. So I'm not going to go into all the specifics of that, but I think you figured it out. In any event, so these are people who were doubting the fantastic promise of becoming parents. In the beginning of this chapter, the doubts were confirmed by Abram as he told God his only heir was his servant, which was common practice in his day. So he said, look, I've got no heirs. I've got no son. I've got no children. So when I die, it's going to go to my lead servant. That was the custom at the time. That's what he told God. So he was just saying, God, I understand what you're talking about, but I don't have an heir. Like God didn't know that. God surely figured it out. But he, as with all of us in our walk in faith, we ask some stupid questions of God. I won't ask you for examples. I'm not going to give you any from my life. What I can tell you is when we get stuck in situations like that, where they're impossible situations, we end up sometimes doubting God. And we think in our minds, well, I'm not going to say it out loud, but God knows our hearts. So it's like he already knows. So you might as well come with him with your doubts. And that's what Abram did. But it says in the beginning of the chapter, his doubts were, like I said, but Abram, it actually says in the chapter there that he did agree and he said yes, and God, knowing his heart, said it was counted to him as righteousness. We find more about that in Hebrews, but this was not the first blood covenant. Talk about that a little bit. As we will see, the elements of the blood covenant are all here in this account. Well, not in this particular account, but you will see later. Well, not all of the 9 pieces. I'll give them to you in a second here. We're present with everyone who brokered one. We saw in our study of much covenants in the world culture. In the Bible, we see the foundation for all of them. Of course, that was Genesis. And Genesis is the book of first. We know that. So the first blood covenant was between God and Adam and Eve. And so when you read that, you don't necessarily put that together, but you have to understand they were trying to cover themselves with something other than God's provision. And so they had never seen death. They had never seen any of those animals killed. So when God killed that animal in front of them to give them skins to wear, that was a shock to them. But that was the first blood covenant, because you see in there, he detailed all the things. He talked about, the serpent, the woman, the man. Those were all the terms of the blood covenant. And then, of course, so they knew what was going on. And then, of course, you go back to Cain and Abel, and it continues. And people wonder how come. They say, well, they both brought offerings to the Lord. How come God didn't accept one and accepted the other? Well, okay, Cain knew what the right sacrifice was. He knew how to do it, but he didn't. So Cain brought from his resources, and Abel brought from his sacrifice, because that was when you sacrifice your animals, you're giving up food and in some cases survival. So he brought a sacrifice that was what he needed. And Cain was upset, of course, then he of course killed his brother. That's why that was. So that was another example of a blood sacrifice. Now we got Abraham here, who's Abram, and now they're detailing it like that. So you can see that that's the first one there. But as we will note, there are some major distinctions because the 2 parties involved. So the elements of the blood covenant are here. And we're going to focus in on Abram here. Here are the 9, if you want to know what they are: exchanging coats or robes, exchanging belts, and now in that case, belts held the swords and the weaponry, cutting the covenant, which was, of course, sacrificing the animals, and then raising the right arm and cutting the palm of the hand and then clasping them. We'll talk about that when we talk about Jonathan and David, because that's what they did. Mingling each other blood was the same process. Exchanging names, making the scar some identifying mark, giving the terms of the covenant. So you talk about what's this for, eating the memorial meal, and then planting a memorial tree. So those are the 9 things. Now, we don't see them all in one place with Abram and Abraham as he will become, but we see him in his life, and I will detail that for you. But go ahead.
Who made up these rules, God, or did somebody?
Who made up the rules? God, yeah.
I mean, DJ actually sent them down in that order, like you just said.
Yeah. These are the elements of it. Not every blood covenant has these elements as a part of it. Okay, just want to let you know that. But we will see these elements in Jesus and his covenant with us. Every single one of them are being fulfilled. So now how they knew that covenant? Well, when Adam sinned, he lost that daily communion with God, but he knew a lot before then. So he knew. Now, and I believe, even though it's not said in Genesis, it was understood what was going on. So in other words, we know, because we don't, in the Bible, we only get what we need to know. We don't get, sometimes we don't get details, but the rest of the Bible fills in the details. The Bible will interpret itself. So we know they knew what the blood covenant was. And we also know because other cultures picked it up. And that's what I dealt with in the first week, which is, if you want to get those notes, they're a little clinical. It's hard to kind of grab, but they're there. I sacrificed the first week for a really hard study, knowing that we would get to the fun stuff in the last week. So that's just the way it goes. But I always like to give you a lot of history and a lot of information so you can do with it what you want. Last week, we talked about the importance of the blood and a heart in the sacrifice. So that was last week. And then, of course, today we're going to talk about blood covenants in the Bible itself. Next week, like I said, is the real fun part, because Jesus in his blood covenant with us fulfilled every single one of these things. You may get a little ahead of this whole thing because I think you'll see you can connect the dots, but I'm going to lay it out for you next week. Same time, same bat time, same bat channel, same bat place. So there we go. Okay, so breaking these things down, we're going to now look at Abraham here. In the account of Genesis 15, we don't see all the elements right there, but the first of them. There's the shedding of blood done by cutting the animal sacrifice and splitting them in half. In a blood covenant between two parties, the two would walk down the middle of the animals and exchange positions. In the case of Abram, God had to do this with Abram in a deep sleep because he couldn't see God and live in the physical realm. There are other reasons why he did that. And in the exchanging of robes and belts, which would allow both parties to share in things, Abraham was not bringing much to the table in exchange with the creator of the universe. So this was what we call an unequal or unbalanced covenant. So, in this situation, it's much like Jonathan and David, and we'll talk about that in detail because Jonathan had more to bring to the covenant than David at that moment. Now that would switch.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
I actually never did understand that completely. Between Cain and Abel, the sacrifices.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat that part before you go any further?
Yeah, sure. It wasn't in the notes, but I'll repeat it for you. Cain and Abel, they were supposed to bring a sacrifice to the Lord, and Cain brought a sacrifice from the grains and like that. Basically, he got from his garden. Okay, but Abel brought an animal that was sacrificed.
Now, there are two reasons why that makes an important difference. First off, Cain was giving from his surplus, and Abel was giving from his sacrifice, because that's what it is.
There it is.
And also, they knew full well what a blood sacrifice was because their parents, Adam and Eve, saw the blood sacrifice and knew what it was as well. Okay, so okay. All right, so let's go back down to Abram here. So we put him in deep sleep because you can't broker the covenant with God because you can't see him and live. So he had to put him into a deep sleep, and that's where the exchange occurred. All right. And like I said before, Abram did not have much to bring. I mean, you think about it, all the resources that God has, and you're coming into a covenant with him, of course you're not going to have as much as God. So God not only took the lead on this whole thing, it was an unequal covenant, but he takes all the responsibility of fulfilling it. That's another reason why. And if you can't figure out that when we talk about Jesus, well, we'll detail that next week. But I just want to let you know that's what's happening here. So anyway, though, there's no sharing of a meal since God, again, is God who's doing this. So, and then there's no exchange of blood for the same reason. So you can't commingle blood with God because he's a spirit. But his son Jesus, we'll talk about that next week. Anyway, though, literally God was fully responsible for this covenant, and the terms of the covenant are detailed progressively with God elaborating them. So he gives the first terms in 12, and then you got to go to 15 and 13 and Genesis 17 and Genesis 22. He eventually lays out everything for Abraham. So you don't get it all in one fell swoop. And the same thing is true of other covenants that we'll talk about. But anyway, though, and this is an interesting part because, however, God does change the names from Abram, which means high father, to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude, and Sarai, which means my princess, to Sarah, meaning mother of nations. Now, what did he do there? If you look at just the simple lettering in English, he puts his name in their name. He puts Yahweh in their name. That's what he did. So, what? Because he's God. Well, look at the letters. Do you see YH in there? Or something Yahweh like? Sarai to Sarah, Abram to Abraham. See, so like I said, I could get into the Hebrew on that and show you a little clearly, but that's part of the blood covenant. You exchange names. God literally put, so if you want to know how come he changed Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, now you know why. Because now whenever you hear Abraham and Sarah, I'll get you in a second. When you hear Abraham and Sarah, it is always a testament to knowing that God is in the midst of them and his name is in their name. And that's why they don't say Abram, they say Abraham, because it's respect for what God has done. Okay.
I didn't hear you mention about the circumcision.
I didn't, because I haven't done it yet. No, I didn't. No, this is the first week I'm talking about it. Yeah, so if you didn't hear about it in the last 2 weeks, because I didn't mention it. Because as a guy, I really like talking about circumcision. It just does something for me. I'm sorry, Kathy. You teed it up. I had to hit it. Yes, TMI. And there'll be the conversation around the lunch table about this, I'm sure. If you find me after the service, I will not entertain that question. This is the only time you're going to be talking about it today. Anyway, though, so you're right. I did mention the mark of this covenant is circumcision. It's in there, so thank you. I didn't mention. That's what you were trying to do. You were trying to keep me on track. Something that you do for your husband all the time, and I should have listened to you. In any event, thank you for that. Now I know why you mentioned it. So what about the tree? So the planting memorial tree. He actually eventually did that, and we're going to talk about that here. This would happen in Genesis 21:33. When Abram plants a tamarisk tree. Now, by itself, you might have glossed over that in your devotions, but I'm going to tell you why. In a blood covenant traditions, planting a tree and sprinkling the ground with the blood from the parties was a way to show the strength of the bond as a reminder of the sacrifices both made. Now, if you weren't here for the previous times, especially the first week, we talked about the covenant tree in cultures around the world in history. So there is that there. This is where it comes from. So Abraham did not get all those things, but when you do that, here's what it talks about. In this case, it was Abraham's way of saying that God that this land would be his home and the home for all future generations. So it was where he planted the tree that makes the difference. Now, the tree itself could have some significance as well. But when he finally got to the land of promise, he was actually in the land of promise and he planted the tree. That was the last piece of the covenant. Now, you could say that there was more to it. I'm going to get to Abraham and Isaac and that sacrifice next week. But now you know why he planted the tree there. So again, in these devotionals, you might read that and go, where's that from? Why is it there? And you'll miss the context because you have to see the blood covenant here. In any event, he was putting down deep roots, which is a hallmark of that type of tree. So if you go to anywhere, go to Google or whatever you want to do, and you search for what a tamarisk tree is, it's known for its roots going very deep. And it lasts for up to 100 years. So it's very long lasting and it's going to stay there. All right. Yes, go ahead.
So with Jesus' sacrifice on the tree of Calvary and the blood going down around here, does that any kind of relationship to this or not?
You think? Yes. Yes. But you're getting ahead of me, though. That's the thing. So you are connecting the dots, something your husband has yet to do.
Question two.
And I came back for this. Yeah, there you go. Yes, Deidre.
Okay, I can get a question this week. Are the tamarisk trees, are they mentioned throughout the Bible at all?
Only 3 times in the Bible.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So
And were they specifically supposed to be used when it came to planting a tree?
no.
Oh, okay.
What I'm saying is that he planted the tree as a part of the blood covenant with God, but one of the meanings that we probably are sure of is that he was saying, before I got to the promised land, I couldn't plant the tree because that wasn't my home. Now he's in the promised land, which will eventually be, given to Israel. And so he planted the tree there because it was his way of saying this is the last piece of the blood covenant, and I'm putting down my roots because this is the land God promised me. Okay, so
Is that literal, by the way, planting the tree?
Yeah.
I wonder how long he carried it around and how it lived.
I just have no answer for that. Well, the question was, how can you have carried it around all the time? Well, he didn't carry around a full-blown, full-grown tree. He probably, what happened was, it was common to have these trees around that area. He probably got one from somebody else and planted it. So,
Connecting the dots.
yes, now, yeah, he connected the dots this time.
Did these trees produce anything or were they just
Tamarisk.
greenery?
Tamarisk.
Huh?
Well, Deidre, I'm not,
What's a
I
tamarisk?
did look at that. The question was, do they produce what kind of fruit?
Yeah.
It's not germane to what we're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it does produce shade because of the way that it does things. It produces salt, and at night, and then there are a lot of people like Saul went under the shade of the tamarisk tree. So, but that's not really the main point. The two main points is they have deep roots and they're not going to go anywhere. But the second thing could also be this on a website that I noted here. 2 plants are mentioned in Genesis 21. The first, the shrub on which Hagar placed Ishmael. In verse 15. The second is the tamarisk planted by Abram, verse 33. The shrub could also easily be a tamarisk because this is one of the most common shrubs. Why did Abraham plant the tamarisk? Trees were often used as memorials for great men. It is therefore appropriate that Abraham would honor God by planting the tamarisk. It would be a permanent memorial of the covenant between the two. So there's a lot of stuff in there, but that's all I want to get to. All right, that. So you see the covenant pieces are all there with the significant differences noted. So all 9 are there with some exceptions. And the exceptions are that it was God who he's covenanting with, and therefore some things could not be done. And then he eventually got the rest of them there. So, and then, like I said, next week I'm going to talk about, where Abraham was told to take Isaac to sacrifice him, and the ram was there. I'll talk about that more in detail next week because that's also a place where okay, flowers, she says. Okay, anyway, now let's turn to the covenant made by Noah, or with Noah, in Genesis 8:20, 20-22, 9 verses 8 to 11. It says this: Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed his burnt offerings, the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. So when he called all the animals into the ark, God planned on this sacrifice. Their animals, the only reason they were on the ark was for this sacrifice once they got out of the ark. So people thinking, oh, that's why we don't have unicorns. No, that's not why we don't have unicorns. He didn't sacrifice the unicorn. There were somebody laughing now. What? Yeah, that's making some people unhappy. But anyway, I created the rabbit and I chased the rabbit. That's what I did there. Okay, just so you know. Say what? Anyway, if you didn't hear that, he's saying the rabbit was chasing me. All right, so talking about Noah, so the burnt up. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they still do that. Yeah, they plant memorial trees. Yeah. In any event, so Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrifices burnt offerings, the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. Going on to 9, verses 8 to 11. Then God told Noah and his sons, I hereby confirm my covenant with you and your descendants, and with all the animals that were on the boat with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, every living creature on earth. Yes, I am confirming my covenant with you. Never again will flood waters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth. So that's the covenant God made with Noah. Now Noah knew he needed to honor God with the blood sacrifice, since he and his family were safe in the flood, and he took animals that were on the ark for this very purpose. And as the narrative tells us, God was pleased. Although the rainbow is used to denote a sinful lifestyle today, It was a covenant signed with man that God would never destroy the earth by water again, no matter how evil they would get. So whenever you see a rainbow, that's what God's saying. That is very, people just take that for granted. You know, all the time we talk about, is it going to be a double rainbow? But they miss the significance of the rainbow. So every time I see a rainbow, I try to remind myself that God is going to, it's a symbol of God's grace, not of man's sin. And so maybe you need to remind yourself whenever you see a rainbow, this is where it starts. Did you want to say something? Yeah. Yeah.
Animals that he would sacrifice.
Yes. Yes.
There were more of them too.
Yes.
Yes. So just so you know, like I said, I'm giving you an overview. I can't give you as many details as I would like to, but you're on the track. And what I always like you to do is, if you got questions like that, just go read the Bible and find the narrative, and let God show you that. He will show you things that maybe you didn't see before. So what now, Kathy?
So you didn't want me to ask.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine with it. Now, if Dick asks it, then I'll have a problem.
Answer the next year.
Yeah, because he'll ask me a question that I will answer probably in 3 or 4 months. So I like to play the clock. I'll run the clock out on that. Yeah, that was a joke, Jenny. Yes, it was a joke about the tamarisk tree. No, I know it's not at all. All right, so let's move on to something a little more substantial, the blood covenant between Jonathan and David. In this, let's go to 1 Samuel 18, 1-4. Now, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off his robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So we know this is a blood covenant because this specific thing is mentioned, the exchanging of the robes and the coat. Now, so he was giving him his armor basically and giving him the belt, which held the sword and all the other stuff. So that was an exchange of power. And Jonathan, like I said before, this is another unequal covenant where God is saying, or in this case here, Jonathan is saying, I have more to offer to you than you have to offer to me, but I don't care because I love you. So that was that. Now, I like how Pastor Bob Yandian describes this particular covenant. The Hebrew word for made a covenant means to cut. David and Jonathan cut a blood covenant with each other because God brought them together. They recognized it and mingled their blood, thus joined their lives to each other. Now, we'll talk about the mingling of the blood on the hand, especially the hand, the cutting of the hand. And they would put something in there. A lot of some culture would put gunpowder in there so it would scar. And so I'm getting ahead of myself, but whenever David was someplace and they didn't know who he was, he would just raise his hand because it was to be the mark they saw in Jonathan. They know, hey, look, if I come against this shepherd boy, there's a Jonathan who's the son of the king, I'll be in big trouble. You see that? So in any event, that's what was going on. So we know that they did a blood covenant and all the elements are there because they talked about the exchanging of the robes and the belts. And because they're making a covenant, it's the same word as the covenant in Abraham. So it means in Hebrew to cut a covenant. Anyway, though, so they did all above. So let me read this quote from Pastor Bob Yandian. David and Jonathan cut a blood covenant with each other because God brought them together. They recognized it and mingled their blood, thus joined their lives to each other. Like Abraham with God, David had more to gain from this covenant than Jonathan. But they were not in this covenant to take, but to give. David was a shepherd. Jonathan was the son of the king. David had a few possessions to give. Jonathan had the riches of the kingdom at his fingertips. David had a slingshot for his protection, and Jonathan had the military of Israel. They exchanged their robes, honor, sword, and belts. This meant that now, by the robe, the power and the authority of the kingdom was as much David's as it was Jonathan's. So it was with the armor, Jonathan would be David's protection. By the sword and bow, Jonathan would be David's defender. And by the belt, all children that come to their loins would be included in the covenant. We'll find out about that in the next paragraph. David and Jonathan were more than friends. They were covenant friends. Jonathan and David loved each other as much as they loved themselves. You can cross-reference those verses there. So that was a blood covenant. And then that one really gives you a lot of the interpersonal blood covenants that could be made. Now, like we said in that last quote here, while there isn't a lot of the usual blood covenant details in the Bible, as Yandian rightly notes, the Hebrew word for covenant strongly suggests the other elements were there, as well as the actions toward each other going forward. You would see on more than one occasion, Jonathan warned and protected David when Saul was trying to kill him. And if you look in I think it's either 1st or 2nd Samuel 23, when David was feeling particularly down, Jonathan said, "You're going to be king," because he knew the prophecy over him. So David had to encourage himself in the Lord. That's the context of those scriptures. That when you read about David encouraging himself in the Lord, those are in the notes from yesterday, by the way, from yesterday's class. But David encouraged himself in the Lord, and Jonathan also encouraged him, says, "Look," and he did this because he made a blood covenant with David. And so everything that Jonathan has, he would not only have access to, but would one day get as well. So all of these things play into it. So, and if you ever broke a blood covenant, that was bad news in the Middle Eastern culture. Any blood covenant you break. So it's very, as I talked about in the first week, and this is, you want to grab that. David Livingstone made his way through Africa by making blood covenants with these tribes because he found out about it. And then Stanley, who went to find him, did the same thing. So if you want to know how Livingstone survived in Africa for so long, it's because he knew he brokered blood covenants with all the tribes. And what he would do is he'd find the tribes that were more powerful. Smart guy, right? He'd find the ones that were the most powerful, and then he would broker a covenant with them. And then he would know if he went to somewhere else, he would say, "Hey, I'm in blood covenant with this tribe here. You better leave me alone." See, so that's the power of that, though. And then it is so tempting to give away next week to Dave, and I'm not going to do it. But I think you kind of are ahead of me on this whole thing. I think you can figure it out. Yeah.
What kind of covenant would he do? Like what?
Well, in their culture, you'd find out how they brokered the blood covenant, and he would do it. Some of them would drink blood. Some of them, there are other things. Like I said, I dealt with all that the first week.
But
How would he know?
No, like he'd say, "Hey, I want to make a covenant with you." Like, what does he have to offer? Like, why would they do that with
That's the thing. See, they come together, and a lot of these covenants were basically, I'm going to protect you. Well, I don't know what he offered to give him back. In history, I don't find that. All I know is he found the most powerful tribes, and that's how he went from place to place, because he could only say, "I brokered a covenant." There was one place where the guy wouldn't do it for him, and so he just had to work around that. But I don't know what he had that they needed, but they did it. And sometimes, like you said, these uneven covenants, they said, "Look, you don't have anything to offer me, but I like you. I like, you're treating me nice." Maybe there were supplies they needed. We don't know because we don't get the history. Yes, Rick. What now?
I said, could it possibly be a healing that he would heal one of the tribes?
Oh yeah, he could have brought medicine with him. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Rick was saying, could it possibly be he brought some kind of healing to them? Like I said, I didn't do as deep a dive into all the history, but that's how he did it. Say what now?
You don't want to hear what she said.
Okay, then you're not gonna tell me.
I'm not gonna squeal on her either, baby.
And we're walking. Okay. The covenant and Mephibosheth. You try saying that 3 times in a row. I'm just telling you right now. You're a better person. Who will now forthwith be called M. So, that guy whose name starts with an M. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of God. So remember we talked about the around the loin that any of your children would also be part of the covenant. Here's where you see it. So anyway, though, in that verse I just mentioned, 2 Samuel 21:7, in this verse we see a microcosm of how King David showing mercy and protection to the son of Jonathan because of the blood covenant made all those years before. For the full story, we turn to 2 Samuel 9:1-7, and then verse 13. And David said, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there still not someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in his feet. The king said to him, where is he? And then King David, and then they told him where was that. He said, it's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel of Lodebar. When King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel and at Lodebar, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of David, came to David, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. Now, we can take a little bit of literary license here, okay? Mephibosheth knew he was the grandson of Saul. And he, like many other people, were fearful of King David because Saul did not treat King David well. So he probably was hiding and didn't want to make himself known. And I don't know if King David knew, but maybe he was like saying, if there's anybody out there that's related to Jonathan, I want to find him because I know I want to help him out. And maybe he knew this is the last one. Well, Mephibosheth is going around going, well, there's no way I'm going to do that because he's going to kill me. So he bowed to him when he got in his presence. That's what we see here, and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And now get this, I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat my table always. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. We could go into a different study on that, but the bottom line is this: he went from being impoverished to being wealthy because of the blood covenant that David and Jonathan made. So you begin to see the importance. That's how strong these covenants were. As I talked about in the first week, there were some places where if you entered into a covenant of somebody that was not even related to you, you couldn't even think about marrying their daughter because they were considered relatives. So that's how strong it was. In any event, the tables were turned, as we found out here. At the beginning, we know that David had little to offer to the original blood covenant in comparison to Jonathan. But now, as King David was in the position to rid himself of the legacy of King Saul by killing Mephibosheth, and he didn't do it. It was the covenant with Jonathan that kept him from doing it, and it was this offer of love that drove the search for this lame son of his beloved friend. Turning again to Pastor Yandian, the illustration of the extent of this blood covenant is seen here. He says this, but David saw Mephibosheth through the eyes of the covenant he had made with Jonathan before he was killed. David looked on Mephibosheth and saw Jonathan. When Jonathan had poured out in love to David, David got to pour out in love on Jonathan's son. When Mephibosheth saw the benevolence of David poured out on him, he was shocked. He called himself a dog. That's in verse 8. I'm going to take a small amount of liberty here. This is where I was kind of getting ahead of myself with the story at this point. Putting a few things together from what is written, I want to address what might have been going through Mephibosheth's mind. It must have first struck him that David figured out all wrong. He struck him that he had figured out David all wrong. He figured it out right now. He had believed a lie about David. David was a man of love, not of vengeance. David was thinking of Mephibosheth above himself. Why would David do this to a poor son of Jonathan? Why would David treat a lame man with such honor and give him back so much of what his father and grandfather used to own? Why would David make Mephibosheth like one of his own sons? As Mephibosheth laid in the floor, David reached down to lift him up. Mephibosheth saw in David's hand a scar. That was the same scar he remembered in the hand of his father Jonathan, and suddenly he understood it. David and his father were in blood covenant together. He was receiving a blessing into his life today that began before he was ever born.
That's cool.
So,
Is that biblical? That scar thing?
yeah.
Never saw that.
Yeah, and like I said, I keep referring back to first. That was also something that was found in other blood covenants cultures that they would do that.
Making reference to
Yeah.
the fact that Mephibosheth or whatever.
Yeah.
Did he actually see that scar?
Well, we're taking literary license.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
yeah.
All right.
The Yandian says I'm taking literary license.
Well,
here.
you made a good point though.
Yeah.
You lifted him up. The king lifted him up. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you know, it because the scar was there, he would have seen the scar on his father Jonathan's hands
Right,
as well.
right.
So again, I don't think it's too much of a literary stretch to say that, but you
No.
can't find it in.
Makes sense.
So okay, so is there a better covenant? Of course there is, and we'll take a look at it in our next lesson. But I'll leave you with a hint from the author of the book of Hebrews. We'll be spending a little bit of time there next week. Hebrews 8:6. but now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, talking about Jesus, to the extent that he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. So better promises than what David did with Mephibosheth? Yes. And I like I said, it's so tempting to give you a little bit of next week, but I'm just going to let the tease be there. Without giving too much away, we'll see how the new covenant we have with Jesus is superior to all previous ones and give practical applications of each of the 9 parts of a blood covenant to support it. You'll see how God, through his son Jesus, extends promises to us that are incredibly strong and potent and are backed by a God who is all-knowing, everywhere present, and all-powerful. And I don't see Buzz here, but that's a good place for an end. Amen, folks. Okay. So again, tease for next week, but let's pray and close the class here. At least we can have some questions. We got more time left. Father, we thank you for this time today, and we thank you for just whetting our appetite for the blood covenant that you brokered with us when you died on the cross. All that blood covenant, that better covenant that's talked about in Hebrews, you had that plan before the creation of everything. That was already set in motion before we were even created. And I ask that right now that you'll keep us safe this week. You'll keep us blessed this week. And Father, make known to us that we are in covenant with you. And let us just get a little hint of that. And then, Father, I pray you bring us back next week. In Jesus' name, amen.